Hi, I'm the woman my husband spent years tearing down. The day I lost my job, he laughed in my face, called me useless, said he'd always known I'd fail. He thought I had nothing left, but I never told him about the patent I'd sold for $97 million. So when he pushed for a divorce to upgrade, I smiled, signed, and stayed quiet. Months later, when he finally learned the truth, that smirk vanished in an instant. Before we dive in, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments, and guess how this ends. The wind carried that crisp, late autumn bite that makes you reach for a sweater without thinking. From the kitchen window, I watched the last streaks of daylight fade behind the bare trees. The house was warm enough, but there was a draft I couldn't place. Maybe from the cracked seal on the back door, or maybe from the way my husband had been looking at me since I got home. It had been a Tuesday. Ordinary in every way, until 3:17 p.m. when my manager asked me to step into his office for a quick chat. I knew before I sat down that it wasn't a chat. I'd been with the company for 9 years, senior RD, patents under my belt, leading a team that brought in millions, and yet, that day, all I heard was downsizing and realignment. My position was no longer sustainable. I drove home in silence, thinking maybe my husband, David, would at least pretend to care. By 6, the living room smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted chicken. Not because he'd cooked, he'd ordered catering. "Some of the guys are coming over," he'd said when I walked in. "Figured we could all catch up." By catch up, he meant he could hold court and remind everyone how well he was doing. He was pouring bourbon for himself and his 2 friends, Tom and Greg, when I came in from hanging up my coat. "Hey, honey," David said, smiling without warmth. "Everyone, this is my unemployed wife." He laughed, taking a slow sip like it was the punchline of a good joke. Greg chuckled awkwardly. Tom avoided my eyes. I managed a polite smile. "Good evening." "Yeah," David went on. "She finally proved me right. Always said the corporate world was too cutthroat for her. Guess I was right." He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, had been perched at the far end of the table, nursing a glass of Chardonnay. She'd been in town for a week, helping out, though her version of helping usually meant pointing out everything I wasn't doing right. "Well," Eleanor said, swirling her wine, "some women just aren't cut out for real responsibility. That's not a bad thing. It just means you're better suited for other roles." I didn't ask what other roles meant. I didn't have to. David smirked, his friends now more comfortable joining in. "Don't worry, babe," he said. "I'll handle the big stuff from now on. You can, I don't know, join a book club or something." I kept my gaze steady, though inside, every word landed like a small, sharp pebble. While David launched into a story about a deal he was closing, I slid my hand into my lap, tilted my phone slightly, and opened my banking app. The number on the screen was steady, unblinking. $97,438,621. That patent sale from months ago had cleared without anyone in this house knowing. Not David, not Eleanor, no one. I looked back up. He was still talking, waving his glass for emphasis. His friends nodded in rhythm with his voice, like they were under some spell. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I just took in the scene, the polished wood table, the clink of ice in glasses, the faint scent of the food I hadn't been asked to serve. I felt the familiar weight of his arrogance, only this time it didn't crush me. It centered me. Eleanor rose, excusing herself to check on dessert, brushing past me with that faint, perfumed air of superiority. David was leaning into Greg now, explaining how freeing it was for me to be out of the rat race. I reached for my water glass, sipped slowly, and let my mind wander, not to the loss of a job, but to the quiet, steady power of a plan forming. By the time plates were cleared and coats were being shrugged on, I'd already decided. I would not speak of the account, not hint at the deals I'd been quietly working on. I'd let him bask in this little performance of his, Let him believe the story he'd spun tonight. When the last guest left, David patted my shoulder like he was comforting a child. "We'll get through this, babe," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of false benevolence only a man who thinks he's won can manage. I smiled up at him. "I'm sure we will." And in that moment, I knew exactly when I'd let him lose everything. And 2 weeks later, I sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the coffee maker filling the silence. Morning light spilled in through the blinds, painting thin golden lines across the counter. I'd been up since dawn, but not because I couldn't sleep, more because I wanted every detail of this day etched in my memory. I heard the front door open and close. His footsteps carried that same confident weight I'd known for years, the sound of a man who believed the room belonged to him before he even stepped inside. A moment later, he walked in, followed by his lawyer, both in crisp suits, as though they'd been preparing for some kind of victory lap. "Morning," he said, dropping into the chair across from me without waiting for an invitation. His lawyer set down a leather briefcase, pulled out a neat stack of papers, and slid them toward me with a faint, calculated smile. "We've discussed what's fair," my husband began, voice low and deliberate. "Given how different our paths are, this is really a mercy. You should find someone who actually needs a partner." The lawyer jumped in smoothly. "This settlement offers you clarity, no long, drawn-out process, no unnecessary drama. You'll have your clothes, personal belongings, and a modest stipend to help you start fresh. Clean break for both of you." I let my eyes drop to the pages. Minimal alimony, no share of marital assets, no mention of the years I'd supported him through his failed ventures, or the times I'd stayed up nights sorting through bills while he slept like the world owed him rest. I didn't argue. I didn't even sigh. I simply reached for the pen. Their eyes flicked toward each other, a brief flicker of smug satisfaction passing between them. They thought my silence was surrender, my signature an act of desperation. While I signed, I thought about my father's voice, the one I hadn't heard in over a decade. He used to say, "If someone's digging a hole, don't take the shovel away. Just make sure they have enough rope to finish the job." I slid the signed pages back across the table. The lawyer gathered them up quickly, like he'd just captured the winning hand in a card game. My husband leaned back, that self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "For both of us." I met his eyes briefly, then looked away, as though the words had hit me harder than I wanted to admit. Inside, though, my mind was already cataloging every bank account password, every property deed, every thread of a business account he'd forgotten I still had access to. I didn't need to fight now, I just needed to make sure the pieces were in place. "I'll start packing today," I said quietly. "That's best," his lawyer agreed, already standing. What neither of them knew was that buried deep in the title paperwork for this very house was a clause he'd never noticed, one that would mean he couldn't sell or transfer the property without my written consent. He thought I was walking away empty-handed. In truth, I was walking away with the lock to a door he'd one day need to open. Once they were gone, the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I moved through the room slowly, opening drawers, sliding hangers from the closet rail, folding each piece of clothing with care. But each time I placed something into a box, I tucked in something else. Bank statements, photocopies of contracts, receipts for purchases he thought I'd forgotten. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, the hallway was lined with neat stacks. From the outside, they looked like the belongings of a woman starting over. But I knew the truth. These boxes were more than fabric and photographs. They were ammunition. As I taped the last box shut, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face was calm, almost serene. No one looking at me would guess what I was holding in my hands or what I was holding back. I took one last slow walk through the kitchen, running my fingers along the counter where the morning had begun. It felt like another lifetime already. Tomorrow, the house would be quieter without me here. But the echo of today's silence, the one they mistook for defeat, would follow them much longer than they realized. I opened the door, stepped into the cool night air, and lifted the first box into the car. I packed my things in silence, but every box I carried out wasn't just clothes. It was evidence. I set the last box in the trunk, closed it quietly, and stood there for a moment under the porch light. My breath curled in the cool night air, but my mind was already somewhere else, 3 months back, in a cramped room that smelled faintly of solder and coffee. It had been a Tuesday, well past 9 o'clock. The small lab I rented in Raleigh wasn't much, just 2 long workbenches, a battered metal filing cabinet, and shelves sagging under the weight of parts and sketches. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting that pale glow that made the world outside feel 1,000 miles away. I was hunched over the main workbench, my hands stained with graphite and the faint scent of machine oil clinging to my sleeves. The prototype sat in front of me, a sleek little device no bigger than a paperback, wires and casing finally coming together after months of late nights. I remember pressing the final piece into place, hearing that satisfying click. It was done. Not perfect, but functional, and entirely mine. The door creaked, and in stepped Walter, my mentor. 62, semi-retired, and the kind of man who'd rather fix something than replace it. He carried 2 cups of coffee, setting one beside me without a word. "You look like you've been through a war," he said, glancing at the scattered notes. "Feels like it," I admitted, straightening up. "But it works. I think it really works." He studied it, turning it over in his hands. "You know what this means, right?" I did. It meant freedom. Insurance against any storm, personal or otherwise. But I also knew that if my husband caught wind of it, it would never be mine for long. That's why a week before, I'd already contacted my patent attorney, Linda. She was a precise woman in her 50s, sharp eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, the kind who didn't waste words. We'd agreed on every detail. File under my maiden name, use the lab's address as the point of contact, leave no legal breadcrumb back to him. The hum of my phone pulled me from my thoughts. Linda's name lit up the screen. "Ready for some good news?" she asked when I answered. I could use it. The patent's approved. And the sale? Finalized this morning. Medical tech firm out of Chicago. Total $97 million. I gripped the edge of the workbench, my knees suddenly light. "Million?" I whispered, like saying it too loud might break the spell. "Already secured in a trust," she continued, her tone steady. "Payments scheduled. You're protected. But remember, there's a confidentiality clause. If anyone connected to you tries to claim a share, and we can prove they learned about it improperly, they lose everything, including him." Walter had been listening, his brow furrowing in thought. When I hung up, he leaned against the bench, folding his arms. "You've just built yourself a lifeboat in a hurricane," he said. "Now, don't tell anyone, especially not him. Some storms are worth watching from the eye." I nodded, though a part of me wanted to shout my triumph to the world. Instead, I let the quiet satisfaction settle in my bones. I'd done this. No inheritance, no handouts. Just my own stubborn will and a sketch that turned into something real. That night, after Walter left, I stayed in the lab longer than I needed to. I labeled the prototype, tucked the design files into a fireproof folder, and slid them into the bottom drawer of the cabinet. My hands lingered there for a second before I locked it and dropped the key into my pocket. The city outside was still awake when I stepped into the parking lot, but I felt apart from it all, like I was carrying a secret the rest of the world couldn't see. I drove home with the papers on the passenger seat, the streetlights flashing across them in brief golden stripes. By the time I reached the house, the weight of what I'd done settled over me, not as a burden, but as a shield. Whatever storms were coming, I wasn't walking into them empty-handed. That night, I locked the patent papers away, never knowing how soon I'd need them. By the next afternoon, the air had that damp warmth Charlotte gets before a summer storm. I'd left the house early enough to avoid traffic, parking a block away from the cafe he'd picked, one of those sleek spots with tall windows, brass fixtures, and baristas who wear crisp aprons like they're auditioning for a commercial. He was already there when I walked in. Corner table, posture perfect, charcoal suit pressed within an inch of its life. And beside him, leaning back with one manicured hand wrapped around an iced latte, was the woman I'd seen in the background of his social media posts lately. I took my time crossing the room, letting him stand just far enough to make it look polite, but not enough to pull my chair out. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I thought it'd be good to end things like adults." His voice carried that faux sincerity I'd heard before board meetings, right before he'd slide a knife between someone's ribs. "This is Madison," he added, motioning to her with a smile that was just shy of smug. "She's been helping me see life differently. An upgrade, if you will." Madison gave me a look I've seen 100 times on women who think they've won. She was gorgeous, I'll give her that. Perfect hair, a dress that probably cost more than my first car, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I nodded, as if this was all perfectly reasonable. "Nice to meet you," I said, my tone even. The waiter came, setting down a cappuccino for me without asking. Muscle memory from years of working in the same neighborhood. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the steam curl toward my face. "You know," my husband continued, "once the divorce is finalized, I'm not wasting time. I feel free, like I can finally move up in the world without being held back." He was watching me for a reaction. I gave him none. Just sipped. Madison tilted her head, eyes bright with the thrill of saying something cutting. "Must be strange, losing your job and your marriage in the same year. But I'm sure the alimony will keep you afloat, for a while." I met her gaze, still calm. "I'm sure I'll manage." They didn't know that the trust was buried so deep in legal structure, they couldn't find it with a search warrant. The payout from my patent sale? Not even under my current name. Every asset I cared about was sealed tighter than Fort Knox. While they chattered, he about a golf trip he had planned, she about some charity gala, I let my mind wander to the numbers, the accounts, the quiet safety I'd built. They thought they were delivering a blow. I was already standing on higher ground. The conversation drifted, but every so often I'd catch him glancing at me, like my stillness unnerved him. Anger would have been easier for him. Tears, even better. But this steady, almost amused quiet, that wasn't in the script he'd written for me. Then Madison, in her eagerness to show she was part of his new life, let something slip. "Once the house is ours, we'll finally have the kind of space we deserve," she said, flicking her wrist as if waving away the topic. "He's already got the financing figured out." My eyes stayed on her, but inside I felt that click, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. A house, financed with what he thought were marital assets, assets he believed I couldn't protect. I stood after finishing my coffee, setting a tip under the saucer. "Enjoy your lunch," I said lightly. As I walked toward the door, I felt their eyes on my back. He thought I was leaving empty-handed, stripped of power. But in truth, I'd already secured everything that mattered, long before he invited me to this little performance. He thought I was walking away with nothing, but the truth was, I'd already walked away with everything. The next morning, the sky over Charlotte was that perfect shade of pale blue you only get in early spring, when the air still holds a whisper of coolness, but the sunlight makes the marble buildings look almost warm. I parked a few blocks from the courthouse, giving myself time to walk. Each step on the brick sidewalk felt measured, not rushed, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Inside, the tall glass doors swung open easily, and the sound shifted from the muted hum of street traffic to the echo of heels on polished stone. A clerk at the front desk nodded politely, pointing me toward the second floor. I didn't need the directions. I'd been here before, just never for something this personal. My lawyer, Helen, was already waiting outside the courtroom. She looked relaxed, coffee in hand, her suit as crisp as if it had just come from the hanger. "Morning," she said softly, her voice steady in that way that always made me feel like she'd seen every possible trick in the book. Across the hall, my husband stood with his attorney, a younger man with a slick haircut and a grin that said he thought this was already over. My husband's arms were crossed, his tie knotted with precision, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He glanced at me the way you might glance at a piece of furniture you're about to sell, briefly, and without attachment. We were called in, and the proceedings started almost immediately. The judge read through the agreement, point by point. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask for revisions. I simply nodded each time my name was mentioned, signing where Helen slid the papers in front of me. My husband's lawyer stole glances at me, as if waiting for me to argue over some clause or fight for alimony. But I let every term stand. I even declined spousal support outright. You could practically see the satisfaction bloom on my husband's face. His jaw relaxed, his shoulders loosened. To him, this wasn't just winning. This was confirming every story he'd told himself about how easily I could be replaced. "Guess she just wants out," his lawyer murmured under his breath, but loud enough for me to hear. My husband gave a low chuckle in response. Helen remained unreadable, sliding the signed settlement back toward the clerk without a flicker of concern. She knew what they didn't. My life wasn't balanced on this agreement. When the last signature was in place, the judge nodded, paperwork shuffled, and it was done. Just like that. Years of marriage dissolved in less than 20 minutes. We rose, the scrape of chairs filling the space for a moment. At the door, my husband leaned slightly toward me. "Don't spend it all in one place," he said quietly, the words coated in mock sympathy. Madison wasn't here, but I could picture her wearing that same victory smile she had at the cafe. I didn't stop walking. Outside the courtroom, sunlight spilled across the wide marble staircase, so bright it made me squint. Helen touched my arm gently. "You're free to go," she said. Then she stepped aside as the court clerk approached me, an unassuming man with a manila envelope in hand. "This came in for you this morning," he said. His tone was neutral, but his eyes lingered for just a fraction of a second before he moved on to another stack of documents. I waited until I was at the bottom of the stairs to open it. Inside was a single page, confirmation of funds deposited into the trust account. The patent sale had cleared. The figure printed there was almost surreal, commas and zeros neatly lined up, proof of everything I'd built long before my husband decided I was an anchor he needed to cut loose. I folded the paper, tucking it into my bag with the same care you'd give a letter you intended to keep forever. By the time my husband sat down to his victory dinner that evening, probably toasting with the same overconfidence he'd worn into court, my balance sheet would have made him choke on his drink. He thought I was leaving with nothing. The truth was, I'd already left with more than he could ever dream of. By the time his victory dinner was over, my bank balance had more commas than he could ever imagine, but that wasn't the kind of thing you brag about. Not yet, anyway. I'd moved into a small apartment on the east side of Charlotte, the kind of place where nobody looked twice at you coming or going. White walls, one couch, a small table, and a bed. No art on the walls, no statement furniture. It was exactly what I wanted. Plain enough to make people think I was scraping by after the divorce. The evenings were quiet. I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, the hum of the city below blending into the background. My best friend, Dana, called most nights. She was the only one who knew the real number in my accounts. "You're driving me crazy," she said one Thursday night. "Do you know how hard it is to keep my mouth shut when people act like you're broke?" "That's the point," I told her. "Let them think I'm broke." "It's safer." She sighed like she'd had this argument with me a dozen times, which she had. "One day you're going to tell me you waited too long and I'm going to say I told you so." But I wasn't in a hurry. Every week, I heard something new about my ex and his upgrade. People tagged me in photos by accident or sent screenshots from mutual friends. There he was, grinning at some rooftop bar, his arm around Madison while a champagne bottle poured into glasses on the table. Next, a rental Ferrari in Miami, then a weekend in Aspen, complete with luxury lodge selfies. It didn't bother me, not the way they probably hoped it would. All I saw was a pattern. Money going out faster than it was coming in, fueled by Madison's taste for the kind of life that burns through bank accounts like paper. In the afternoons, I'd meet with my financial advisor, Scott. We kept our meetings low profile, coffee shops on the other side of town, or his office after hours. We talked about investments, trusts, and quiet acquisitions. Every move was strategic. Every dollar had a purpose. "You could live in a penthouse tomorrow if you wanted to," he said one evening. "I could," I agreed. "But that would ruin the story they're telling themselves right now. And I want them to believe it for a little while longer." That belief was useful. It made people careless around me. A few weeks later, I ran into Caroline, a woman I'd known for years through business events. She wasn't close to me, but she adored gossip, and gossipers never know when to stop. We chatted in the produce aisle, safe, casual territory. She leaned in halfway through the conversation, lowering her voice as if she were passing along classified intel. "I saw your ex last week," she said, eyes wide. "He was talking about how great life is now. But he mentioned something odd. He's been using the business credit accounts you two had together." "I thought that was strange since you're not involved anymore." I kept my face neutral, like it was nothing more than a passing detail. "Oh? I thought those were closed." She shrugged. "Maybe he just hasn't gotten around to it." Then she wandered off toward the bakery section, leaving me standing there between the apples and the oranges. I didn't need to check. I already knew she was telling the truth. Those credit lines were still active, and still under my name as a silent guarantor. I had the authority to pull the plug anytime I wanted. I finished my shopping in a fog of calm clarity, each step deliberate. If he wanted to treat borrowed money like a personal wallet, then he'd made himself vulnerable. Back at my apartment, I set the groceries down, turned on a small lamp, and poured a glass of water. The city lights outside flickered like they knew something was about to shift. If he wanted to play with borrowed money, I decided it was time to call in the debt. I didn't waste time. The very next morning, I called Scott and asked if he could fit me in. His voice was steady, like always, but I caught that slight pause he gets when he knows I'm about to move something big. By noon, I was in his office downtown, the kind of place where everything gleams: polished wood, glass walls, a faint scent of leather from the chairs. Scott closed the door as soon as I stepped in, setting his phone face down on the desk. "You've decided?" he asked, leaning back just enough to study my face. "Yes," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I want to confirm every joint credit line he's touched since the separation, and then we close them. Freeze. Call in the balance. Today." His brow lifted. "You're certain? It'll hit immediately." "That's the point." Scott turned to his computer, fingers moving fast over the keyboard. In less than a minute, a list popped up on the screen. There they were, 3 open accounts, all still showing me as a guarantor. One of them had a balance that made my stomach tighten, not from fear, but from the sheer scale of his arrogance. "He's been spending like it's never going to end," Scott said quietly. "Travel, restaurants, some high-end boutique charges, and that's just what I can see." "Freeze them all," I told him, "and draw up whatever's needed to demand payment." He nodded, pulling a stack of forms from his cabinet. I signed each page without hesitation, my pen moving steadily. Every signature felt like closing a door he thought would stay open forever. When it was done, Scott handed me a folder thick with documents. "Take this to the bank. They'll process it faster if you go in person." The afternoon air outside carried a hint of humidity, the kind that clung to your skin. I walked the few blocks to the corporate branch, my heels clicking against the sidewalk, the folder tucked under my arm. Inside, the lobby was cool and quiet. The bank manager, a tall man in his 50s with a silver tie clip, greeted me with the kind of practiced professionalism that says he's seen everything, until he saw what I handed him. He flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You understand," he said slowly. "Once I process this, the accounts will be locked. No further charges. And the repayment demand will be substantial." I met his gaze. "I understand." He hesitated just a fraction before continuing. "Mrs." He caught himself. "Miss, the total owed is significant. Payment will be due within 5 business days." "Then I suppose someone's about to have a very interesting week," I said, my voice calm. He slid the documents into a secure envelope and called someone from the back. A quiet flurry of movement followed, 2 staff members disappearing into a side office, the manager making a quick phone call. By the time I stood to leave, I could see the first ripples spreading. The sunlight outside was sharper now, bouncing off the glass towers. I had barely made it halfway down the block when my phone buzzed. His name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. 2 seconds later, a text came through. "What the hell did you just do?" I stopped walking, letting the crowd move around me. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't type back. The fact that he'd felt it this quickly meant the freeze was already in place. And that was just the beginning. I slipped my phone back into my bag and kept walking, the corners of my mouth curving into the smallest smile. I hadn't even made my next move yet, and already he was begging for a meeting. I knew he'd want a public setting. Men like him always do when they think they can steer the conversation, keep up appearances. That's why I chose the same cafe where, months ago, he'd leaned back in his chair and dismissed me in front of strangers like I was nothing. This time, I got there first. The morning light poured through the wide windows, catching the steam rising from cappuccinos and the glint of silver cutlery. I asked the hostess for a table right in the center of the room, one where anyone walking in would see me immediately. I set my bag neatly on the chair beside me and folded my hands on the table. The waitress came over, young, with a warm smile, and asked if I'd like to start with coffee. "Black, please," I said. The simple request felt deliberate. No whipped cream, no caramel drizzle, just straightforward. I thanked her and watched her move between tables, refilling cups, balancing plates. There was a quiet dignity to her work, and I caught myself thinking that this, right here, was the kind of grace I valued. 10 minutes later, he arrived. I saw him before he saw me, pacing on the sidewalk, running a hand over his face. When he finally walked in, his suit was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew, and there were dark half-moons under his eyes. He spotted me and didn't even bother with a hello. "You need to undo what you did," he said the moment he reached the table. His voice was sharp, clipped, meant to intimidate. I leaned back slightly, letting him stand there for a beat before gesturing to the seat across from me. "Have a seat, and let's talk like adults." He sat, but his hands were already clenched on the table. "The credit lines? You froze them. Do you have any idea what you've done? You're strangling me financially. I can't move money, can't make payments. This isn't just petty, it's perfectly legal," I interrupted gently. "And it's exactly what any responsible person would do when they're still tied to accounts their ex is burning through." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand," I said, keeping my tone even. "Flights to Miami, designer clothes, that weekend in Aspen, all while your friend has been encouraging you to live a little. Except it's not your money, it's credit, with my name on it." He blinked, caught off guard. "She has nothing to do with this." "Of course she does," I said, leaning in just enough for my voice to drop. "She's been at your side for every charge. Don't insult my intelligence." The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down with a polite nod. He ordered nothing. When she left, I stirred my cup slowly, letting the silence work on him. You wanted the divorce, I reminded him. You wanted to be free, remember? Well, this is what that freedom looks like. I'm not your safety net anymore. His voice dropped, lower now, more controlled. Oh, if you don't reverse this, I'll go public. I'll tell everyone You'll tell lies, I finished for him, still calm. And you should absolutely try. Because when you do, I'll release every financial record I kept, every transfer, every receipt. I'm sure the IRS would be very interested in some of them. His face went pale for just a second before he looked away. He opened his mouth to fire back, and that's when the door opened. She walked in. The so-called upgrade. She froze halfway to the counter, clearly surprised to see us sitting together. Her eyes darted from him to me, and I smiled like I'd been expecting her all along. Good morning, Lila, I said, my voice warm but with an edge she'd recognize. It's been a while. Her cheeks flushed. You two know each other? He asked, glancing between us. Oh yes, I said, resting my hands lightly on the table. We've met before. Under circumstances she probably doesn't brag about. Lila shifted uncomfortably, looking at him like she wasn't sure whether to stay or leave. He looked at me, then back at her, clearly out of his depth. I let the moment stretch until the air between us felt heavy. Then I leaned forward just enough to make sure they both were looking right at me. And then I told them both the part I'd kept quiet, the one that made their faces drain of color. I didn't look away from either of them. My fingers slipped into my bag, found the thick envelope, and placed it on the table with quiet precision. No flourish, no slam, just enough weight so they both noticed. That, I said, tapping it once, is a notarized summary of the sale of my patent. His brow furrowed. Lila's gaze flicked between the envelope and my face, like she was trying to read the ending before the story was told. Patent? He repeated, his tone halfway between disbelief and dread. Yes, I said evenly. The one I developed before we ever met. The one I sold last month for $97 million. I let the number settle in the air. Conversations at nearby tables seemed to fade into the background. His lips parted, but no words came out. Lila looked like she'd swallowed something sharp. And here's the part you'll love, I continued, my voice still calm. Because it was created and sold before our marriage, it's not marital property. By law, you have no claim, not a penny. The color drained from his face. You're lying. You're welcome to check with my attorney, I replied, sliding the envelope an inch closer to him. It's all there. Dates, signatures, wire transfer records. You'll notice my name is the only one on every page. Lila's hands tightened around her purse strap. Wait, she said slowly. So, you've been sitting on this the whole time? I nodded. And while we're on the subject, the credit freeze, that was just step one. By the end of the week, your accounts will be reviewed for unpaid debts tied to our joint name. That means every overdraft, every late payment, every luxury expense you thought no one would notice. He leaned forward, trying for anger but landing somewhere closer to desperation. You can't just... I already did. Lila's eyes darted to him, panic starting to set in. Hold on, so if everything's frozen and he's got debts... She cut herself off, but I could see the calculation in her face. She was realizing exactly what she'd walked into. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of wood on tile sounding louder than it should have. I stood, smoothing my jacket. Thank you, I said, my voice level. For the closure. I wish you both the very best. Neither of them answered. I left the envelope where it was and walked out without looking back. The air outside felt different, lighter. I took my time walking the 2 blocks to the courthouse, the crisp breeze carrying the faint scent of roasted coffee and car exhaust. Each step put a little more distance between me and years of being second-guessed, diminished, and treated like a convenience. By the time I reached the courthouse steps, my lawyer was waiting. He held a thin folder and a pen. "Last signature," he said with a small smile. I signed without hesitation. He glanced over the pages, then closed the folder. "That's it. Every legal tie is severed. You're officially free." We shook hands, and he headed back inside. I lingered a moment, looking out over the street, the traffic, the people hurrying along with their own troubles. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was about walking away knowing I hadn't let them define me. I reached my car, opened the door, and as I slid into the seat, my phone buzzed. A new notification from the bank. Transfer complete. $97,000 on sole account. The timing made me laugh under my breath. I started the engine, smiling to myself. Not because I'd won, but because I was finally free.